on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, continuing our coverage of Ukraine and the situation in Russia as well. We are now joined by Anatol Lieven. First of all, have I got that pronunciation right?
It's Lieven, but don't worry, I'm used to every possible pronunciation.
Yeah, well, I apologize for that. My last name is often mispronounced and it's phonetic. So, Anatol Lieven, Lieven, is Senior Research Fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which I encourage you to familiarize yourself with. And he has written a number of articles in recent weeks leading up to the invasion of Ukraine and afterwards. His most recent one, at least that I've seen, well, he's had a couple, one on Putin's inner circle, but he had another one that was published, I believe, the day before Zelensky appeared before Congress, entitled "What Zelensky Will Say to Congress and How the U.S. Will Respond." So first of all, Anatol Lieven, thanks for coming on the program.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's our pleasure, and I know you're terribly busy, so we appreciate it very much. Let's start with the speech to Congress. By my read of it, you predicted quite well what President Zelensky was going to say, but you tell me, how did it accord with your expectations?
Well, it was clear that Zelensky was going to ask for a no-fly zone, but I think he knew very well that he wasn't going to get it because the Biden administration, NATO, European governments had made clear that they were not going to do that because that would imply going to war with Russia. You know, you're sending US and NATO planes to fight Russian planes, be shot down by Russian anti-aircraft batteries, and then, of course, the escalation towards nuclear war becomes really, quite a prospect. But I think that he knew or had been told that he would therefore, as a compromise, if you will, get more lower profile, but actually very useful weapons. Because the Biden administration is now transferring drones, which have been extremely effective in the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, and possibly anti-aircraft, not just shoulder-held missiles, but batteries. And of course, the other thing that one should remember that the Ukrainians have now really fought Russia to a standstill in many areas, in many urban areas of Ukraine. Now, they've done that because of their own courage and resilience and unity, obviously far greater than the Russian government expected. But they've also done that with the help of Western shoulder-held anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. So, we have actually been giving very much actually the kind of weapons to Ukraine that the Ukrainians need in urban warfare. And it is through urban warfare that they have fought the Russians to a standstill.
So what we're seeing, in other words, is it strikes me as, as a very moving presentation by President Zelensky, but it seems almost as if he was, as one does while negotiating, ask for more than you expect to get, and then accept the compromise that's offered. Now, if I recall correctly, President Biden has pledged $1 billion more to Ukraine. More weapons are on the way. There's been talk that Ukraine would prefer, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, my understanding is that Ukraine would prefer more powerful anti-aircraft weaponry and so on. You think, in terms of the response, that Zelensky and Ukraine got more or less what they were expecting and hoping for?
I think so, because also this business of transferring fighter jets, the Russians are so superior in the air that I think, limited numbers of fighter jets would be on almost kamikaze missions in Ukraine, whereas anti-aircraft missiles are, of course, tremendously effective. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan, I covered them as a journalist, proved that in the 1980s. So yes, I mean, I think in terms of weaponry, the Ukrainians are getting more or less what they want. The other, or not what they want, but what they realistically expected. Of course, the other element of realism in the Ukrainian position relates now to the peace process with Russia, because Zelensky has said publicly what, frankly, this is greatly to our blame. Everybody should have acknowledged before the war, which is that we were never going to take Ukraine into NATO because we were never going to fight for Ukraine. Therefore, what makes sense is to negotiate a treaty of neutrality with really strong guarantees for Ukrainian sovereignty and independence, which, by the way, of course, also leaves open the possibility and allows us to help Ukraine develop as a successful European free market democracy. Now, on that score, by the way, I mean, weapons to Ukraine now, $1 billion, of course, very good. Absolutely, that's our duty. But the real test will be how much economic aid we give to Ukraine after the war, not just to reconstruct Ukraine, but to help Ukraine really develop as a successful economy and democracy. Because, frankly, US economic aid before this war was pathetic to Ukraine. I mean, all these people who are now demonstrating, in US Congress solidarity with Ukraine, they might have thought about that a few years ago, when Ukraine desperately needed economic aid.
And it seems as if we're experiencing that again today with Afghanistan, right? Where we're seeing a horrific humanitarian disaster unfold there, largely in my view anyway, as a consequence of our own military actions. And yet there's indifference to that, or apparent indifference, in Congress and elsewhere. And forgive me for perhaps getting over my skis, as they say a little bit, Anatol, Lieven, but I feel that my fear is that if cooler heads don't prevail, we will wind up doing the same kind of injustice to the Ukrainians that we've done frankly, to the Afghans and others, encouraging them to rebel or resist or fight a war with Russia when we're not prepared to address their full-scale humanitarian needs, almost as cannon fodder for our own geopolitical aims. Am I being unfair?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Not that this is, of course, true of everybody in the American elites by any manner of means. Sure. But, on the one hand, as in Afghanistan in the 80s, you have the people like Brzezinski, which he admitted quite candidly, or Radek Sikorski, the former Polish foreign minister, who said this to me in a debate before the European Parliament on Monday, that we defeated, Radek said, we defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan at a cost of only a few $1 billion. And I said to him, no, you didn't, Radek. You defeated at a cost of a few 100,000 Afghan lives and the destruction of the Afghan state, with consequences, that came back to haunt us all. So on the one hand, you have these ruthless geopoliticians who frankly don't give a damn for Ukraine or the lives of Ukrainians, who want to destroy Russia and isolate China. And then, of course, you have all the senators and congressmen, I mean, forgive me for being cynical, who will shout and scream as long as it's in their electoral advantage to show off their emotional sympathy for Ukraine. And then a few years down the line, when it comes to, Republicans, for example, voting for US aid, US economic aid to Ukraine, where will they be when that vote comes up? So, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of, frankly, pretty morally disreputable stuff going on here.
And I've wondered a great deal over the years, and certainly in the midst of this conflict, why it is that we support people in war contexts and, are excited to wave their country's flag and do those sorts of things, and yet lose interest when it's time to help their people stay alive. Now, you're with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and you and your organization do wonderful work. But, in doing that work and looking for a more responsible way of handling our position in the world. Is that a matter of defense industry lobbying? Is it a matter of culture, warlike culture? Is it a matter of just as much easier politically to explain why you're on the side of people who are fighting and not so easy to explain why you're on the side of people who are starving? Have you given, I assume you've given thought to that. I'd love to know what your thoughts are.
Well, long before I became a think tankist or a professor, I was a journalist. First in Afghanistan in the 80s and in Pakistan, and then, in the former Soviet Union. And, I don't excuse myself from this in any way. There is, as they say, the media cycle. And there are the journalists and the editors and the audiences, to be fair, who follow, the exciting story of the day, but do not wish to stick with the longer, less exciting, grim, often disillusioning stories of slow economic development or the lack of it, and democratic development or the lack of it, whereas, wars are very dramatic. What I suppose, my disillusionment with this does go back to Afghanistan in the 1980s, because I was a journalist with the Mujahideen, and then I managed to get, with others, we got visas to go on the communist side as well. And, looking back, I am ashamed at how we fell for American and British propaganda and how we well, the thing is, it was bad enough that we grotesquely romanticized the Mujahideen in the 1980s. But then after 2001, not me, I have to say, but many others, then demonized the Taliban and declared, we don't talk to terrorists, we don't talk to... when, of course, the Taliban were, in many cases, exactly the same people, precisely the same people, from precisely the same areas, fighting for precisely the same reasons as the Mujahideen in the 1980s. So it's not just we hop from story to story, but that there is no collective institutional memory of even what we were saying 10 years earlier, or 5 years earlier, or possibly 6 months earlier. That is also, I think, a truly disgraceful thing.
One movie I don't see replayed very often anymore, Anatol, Lieven, is Charlie Wilson's War, if you remember that movie, romanticizing our support, as I recall, for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. It's kind of that entire aspect of our history appears to have disappeared down a memory hole. And now here we are. And the other thing that I find in the discourse very difficult to handle among our media colleagues, among others, is, for example, the avalanche of questions that are asked of Joe Biden, of the Secretary of State, of the White House press secretary. Why not a no-fly zone? What are you going to do in no-fly zone? And of course, people in Congress who may not be well informed on these issues say, let's have a no-fly zone. That seems to be the go-to. But it seems to me you and others have pointed out, which really candidly should be fairly self-evident, which is if you engage in aerial warfare with Russian jets, you're eventually going to shoot one down, and that could escalate potentially to even nuclear conflict. Or am I overstating the case?
Well, no. I think you can draw the line very clearly. The US Air Force might well shoot the Russian jets out of the sky, losing US planes in the process. But then, of course, Russian anti-aircraft missile batteries, which are some of the best in the world, based in Russia, on Russian soil, have the range to cover most of Ukrainian airspace. They would then shoot down American planes in the process. Now, is America going to accept that kind of casualties? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe America then goes in to knock out the Russian anti-aircraft batteries on Russian soil. Well then, Russian aircraft are outclassed by Americans, but Russia has the biggest missile arsenal in the world. It fires intermediate range conventional missiles, but still into American air bases in Poland and NATO to knock them out in return. Now you have the two greatest nuclear powers in the world with the capacity between them to exterminate humanity, firing missiles into each other's territory. This is the kind of thing that the Soviet leadership and Eisenhower and Kennedy managed to avoid during the Cold War. And we are going to get into that again. I mean, of course, the problem is that for years and years, I mean, America was, of course, worn down by guerrillas in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but got used to, in the skies over Serbia and Iraq and Libya, no air force and no anti-aircraft defenses were any good. And so America got used to the idea that a no-fly zone was cost-free, risk-free way of projecting American power. But Russia is not Libya. It's not Iraq. It's not the Taliban. And somehow in the past 30 years, sorry, I suppose we're both of a certain age, right? But young people of today seem to have forgotten, all the lessons that generations of us during the Cold War had to learn. And as I keep reminding people, there were a number of occasions during the Cold War when only the wisdom and caution of one officer, one American or Soviet officer, saved us from nuclear annihilation. Is that what we want to risk again? I mean, really? And by the way, if this happened, I mean, if this escalates towards nuclear war, what would be the first place to be devastated? It would be Ukraine. I mean, is that actually what Ukrainians themselves want? No.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. And it seems to me, one of the other things impairing, it seems to me, our dialogue about this, our internal conversation here in the United States, perhaps in Western Europe as well, is this enormous psychological resistance to negotiation. And we not only don't understand it, we undermine it psychologically. We're recording this conversation on Thursday, the 17th of March. I get the pool reports from the White House press. Apparently, Joe Biden said today that Putin was a thug and I can't remember if it was gangster or dictator. And it seems to me one can acknowledge the criminality of the invasion of Ukraine, and on the other hand, understand that if we're going to avert even more catastrophe than we've seen so far, we're going to have to talk to Putin. And this is not creating an environment for that. But if we don't talk to Putin, if we don't allow the Ukrainians to also pursue the guidelines that Zelensky says he wants to pursue, including a non-membership in NATO and so on, it just seems extremely unhelpful for the president at this moment in history to call Putin a thug. I understand politically why he may want to do this, but it troubles me. And I should also note that on January 25th, which is, of course, before the invasion, you wrote an article, Russia has been warning about Ukraine for decades. The West should have listened. Doesn't it seem that we're still perhaps not listening quite as much as we should?
Well, there is a book, large parts of which are dedicated to calling for diplomacy, to criticizing in a sort of fairly soft and polite way America for its indifference to democracy, and by the way, recording in detail warnings from Russia and from American diplomats in Russia about the consequences of NATO expansion, particularly NATO expansion to Ukraine, and saying that this would lead to crisis with Russia and the possibility of war. You know who wrote this? Present head of the CIA, William Burns, former ambassador to Moscow, former deputy head of policy planning in the 1990s. It's all there, chapter and verse. You've got to negotiate with people you don't like. This is the way the world works. You've got to seek reasonable compromises that, yes, I mean, involve certain concessions that you would rather not make, but to maintain peace, to avoid much greater catastrophes. Yeah, exactly. This is what diplomacy is about. But also, I have to say, the very idea, which is, as you've suggested, really current in Washington now, that Washington should stop the Ukrainian government from negotiating peace with Russia, in which, by the way, President Zelensky has said two very sensible things. One is, it's absolutely clear now that we will never be members of NATO because NATO will never fight to defend us. Therefore, principle of treaty of neutrality, with, of course, all the necessary guarantees of Ukrainian security, sovereignty, and independence, is the logical way to go. And the other thing that Zelensky has said, absolutely rightly, is that every war, well, and actually not every war, but certainly in this case, ends in a peace agreement, ends in talks. Right. Because one thing should be absolutely clear. Russia has failed. Russia has actually lost by now its goals in Ukraine. It's absolutely clear now because of the resistance of the Ukrainian people. Russia cannot turn Ukraine into a subject territory. Right. On the other hand, it's also clear that this war will not end in complete Russian defeat and, Russian withdrawal from Crimea and the Donbass. That's not going to happen. So there has to be an agreement. And for America to block such an agreement for the sake of wider geopolitical agendas, plus, the grandstanding political self-seeking of members of the US Congress, that would be morally disgraceful, actually. Not as bad as Putin, but not creditable.
And I think that's extremely well said. And Anatol, Lieven, I want to kind of flip the angle a little bit and talk about Putin and his inner circle, whom you recently wrote about as well. And I want to do it in part because we know, for example, why Putin might feel endangered by some of the discussions we've had around Ukraine and possibly admitting them to NATO. And, if Canada were admitted to the Warsaw Pact during the 1970s, I think we'd probably also feel threatened. So that's that part of it. While his actions are deplorable, that part of it has a certain logic to it. But I think I am among many people who are looking at the decision to invade. Obviously, Putin is in charge, but presumably with the concordance or agreement of his inner circle, those with the power made the decision to invade Ukraine, which now certainly appears to have been disastrous. So some of us are wondering, well, ethics or morality of Putin aside, how did he get it so wrong? Doesn't he have intelligence people and sources there? How could he miscalculate so badly? So I guess it's a two-part question. Did he, in fact, miscalculate terribly? It certainly seems so. And if so, what might have led to that?
I think he certainly did miscalculate very badly indeed. And I think it's quite right what people say, that Putin's, the people on whom Putin relies has narrowed and narrowed. 10 or 15 years ago, Putin was taking advice from some very distinguished Russian economists with deep knowledge of the world economy and the West. He was taking advice from people who knew the West, intimately. But over the years, and particularly since the beginning of the COVID crisis, his inner circle has narrowed, frankly, to a very small bunch of people who are very like him. They come from the former KGB. They were raised in the Soviet Union. Their initial careers were made in the Soviet Union. They don't know the West well, and they just got it wrong. But also, of course, look at what happened to US and British intelligence before the Iraq War. Well, yes. Look at how, the way in which the Bush and Blair governments simply excluded and suppressed intelligence that disagreed with their wishes and analysis. And then, of course, anybody in the CIA or MI6 or the Foreign Office or the State Department who values their careers are not going to put forward analyses and information which conflict with that of the people in the top. Well, this is in democracies, right? In an authoritarian system like Russia, the pressure to suppress unwelcome information is even greater. So yes, I think they were just terribly informed. It's also interesting, you see, that this is a regime dominated by former intelligence types, but people who in many cases, have not been intelligence officers now for many years. They've been, oligarchs. They've been plundering the state. What it doesn't include in the inner circle is any professional soldiers. And indeed, Putin, in part, rightly, weeded out and purged the upper ranks of the military, which had become deeply corrupt. But I think in the process, he also reduced the upper ranks of the military to basically yes men, to essentially careerists with probably very little intelligence as well as no independence or moral courage, who, in obedience to Putin, came up with a really, really stupid, I mean, leave alone the criminality of it, but a really stupid military plan, which has now got the Russians into a situation which, I mean, look, on the good side, I think it does now genuinely incline the Russian government to seek a negotiated peace. But I mean, that is only because, as I say, they've been fought to a standstill amidst, of course, thousands of Russian military dead, and of course, thousands and thousands of wretched Ukrainian civilian dead.
And I sense, I certainly, hope and pray for a rapid negotiated end to this. But in terms of the long term, Anatol, Lieven, I feel, and you write about this a little bit, but I do sense that, while many in the West mistakenly ascribe communist or left-wing beliefs to Putin, I get the sense somehow that maybe he ascribes to a quasi-mystical conception of Russia as a historical force, an imperial past, and in his belief, an imperial future, that while he doesn't want to restore the Soviet Union per se, that I get the sense he dreams of a new Russian empire, and it's sort of we have manifest destiny in U.S. history, right? That there's some sort of manifest Russian destiny driving his calculations and miscalculations. Am I off base about that?
I think you're exactly right, but I also think Putin has changed over the years because, I've, as part of conferences in Russia, I've listened to him now for 17 years. And particularly recently, one has seen the change. My hair stood on end when he started talking this year, or last year rather, about Marshal Suvorov, the great Russian military hero. He never talked about the Russian past in quite that way. And you got the sense, that this is a man growing old who is becoming obsessed with his historical role as a great Russian hero. And I think that did produce, that has been the surprising thing, that, previously Putin was always cautious, very cold-blooded. I mean, if he gambled, it was always, in the certainty that he was doing so with all the good cards in his hand. This time, I mean, also on the basis, of course, of dreadful intelligence and total underestimation of the Ukrainians. But even so, this was a tremendous gamble, and it's a gamble which is not turning out well for him or Russia. And the good thing about that is, as I say, that I do think that actually now genuinely they are seeking a peace settlement that will allow Putin to go home pretending to have gained a victory. I think that is now genuine on their part. They've given up the idea of conquering the whole of Ukraine.
And this is unfair of me because I'm asking you to speculate, and then what? I mean, as I say, hopefully very, very soon we'll have that negotiation that you describe, and the U.S. will, if anything, try to promote those negotiations, not hinder them. But then what? Does Putin walk away a feeling that he's saved face and he can carry on as before? Or is he the wounded, Macbeth figure sulking in his castle and waiting to strike out at the next real or imagined enemy to restore his honor? Is that too much speculation for you to engage in, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I doubt that Putin, after this, will strike at, willingly or gratuitously strike at NATO for the simple reason that, look, the Russian army has failed. Of course, it's conquered territory, but 3 weeks now, it hasn't achieved any of its main objectives. Now, at that point, I really do think we have to look pretty carefully and cynically at these, Western and NATO suggestions that Putin is going to attack even the Baltic states, let alone Warsaw and Berlin. That, if they can't capture cities 20 miles from Russia's borders, the idea that they're going to invade Poland or, that's nonsense. And I mean, I really do think we have to look at the role of the military-industrial complex and the interests of, generals and so forth in this. But of course, there are two much more sinister questions. One is, what if the next place to experience a revolution is Belarus? From Russia's point of view or Putin's point of view, this would be defensive. They now have to hold Belarus. So there is another civil war, another crisis looming. But the other thing, of course, is that, and I think, this was probably long planned, that Putin is quite clearly using this war to really strengthen repression and authoritarianism at home, and crack down on, destroy the last independent voices in Russia, the last independent media, and of course threatening with 15 years of jail anyone who can be accused of undermining the war effort. And so I fear that, on the other hand, you're going to look at a much more authoritarian, much more closed Russia. And of course, as we've seen in other cases as well, I think that's why I believe that, Western sanctions were legitimate, but they must be linked to a peace process and they must be lifted once we have peace in Ukraine, because I fear that, as we've seen elsewhere, long continued Western sanctions will not bring down the Putin regime. They could actually strengthen the Putin regime.
And if we offer our sticks and no carrot, then they don't have any incentive to do anything we might want to do, whether it's loosening up internal restrictions or anything else, right?
Exactly. And also, I do think, by now it would be a really, really good for Russia if Putin went. But, our record of using sanctions for regime change has been, a universal failure, even a disastrous failure. This has to be left to the Russians themselves. Sanctions could actually contradict that. The other thing is that there's been some very, very unpleasant Russophobia in the West.
Oh yes, yeah.
As a result of all this. Now, this of course risks actually consolidating support for the Putin regime. You're beginning to see Russians who are leaving Russia out of opposition to Putin, encountering this kind of cretinous general anti-Russian feeling, and then going home as regime supporters. That's not what we want to create.
I wrote an article criticizing that Russophobia, and I received some emails suggesting I do things to myself that I believe are anatomically impossible. So I certainly understand that feeling.
Yeah.
Well,
I know. Yes, I too.
I'm sure of it. Well, thank you for your good work in spite of all the headwinds. It's so terribly important. And Anatol, Lieven, I know it's the end of a long day for you, but I'll let our audience know that your work can be found in a number of places, including at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So thank you so much for all your good work, and thank you so much for coming on the program.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.